Yeah, I've got trust issues. I waited till I reached the age of 50 something before I developed trust issues, but I have them big time now. It won't be the first time we've spoken about this, I don't think. I watched, like millions of other people this week, a hearing or a clip from a hearing in the European Parliament, and an MEP asked a director of Pfizer a straight question, to wit, had the vaccine been tested prior to rollout to see if it would stop transmission from person to person of the virus? And the answer from the director, a woman, was they didn't test it for that. That wasn't part of the requirement of the gig. It seemed, and she dismissed the notion quite unconcernedly, which is extraordinary, because that formed the basis for the whole "you must take this medical procedure, not just for you, but to protect others." If it hadn't been tested, if there was no data sought, far less obtained, about whether or not these medical products would stop the virus from spreading person to person, then there was absolutely no basis for insisting that people take it for the greater good of the wider community. That was a falsehood. That was a lie. It was arguably criminal. People were sacked in their tens of thousands from all sorts of jobs because they wouldn't take the procedure. Schools were closed. People's lives were wrecked one way or another. And all of that was done on the basis of a deliberate lie. It's not being reported. That coverage, you'll see it on social media. If you've seen it at all, that's where you've seen it. Out on the fringes of communications. The mainstream media aren't interested in reporting it because they were complicit as well. That whole grand narrative of refuseniks and granny killers and COVIDiots, people who were refusing to take the medical procedure because they didn't feel they needed it, were castigated because it wasn't about them, it was about the fact that they were supposed to be saving others. And so from the top down, Boris Johnson, Whitty, Valens, Joe Biden, the Pope, they all put out the message that taking these jabs, that it was about other people, that it was about the wider community, that it was people's moral obligation, their moral duty to take it not for themselves but to save Granny, not to be a granny killer. And that's appalling to me. So yet again, it got me thinking about trust. I spent the first, I'm 55 now, we've been in this parallel universe for a couple of years now, so I was about 52 or 53 when before I started thinking properly, before I woke up, I had been lazily trusting authority and others. I trusted the government, I trusted the NHS, I trusted the police, I trusted the judiciary, because I assumed that regardless of the politics, regardless of what colour of politician was actually in 10 Downing Street, that those entities collectively and separately had my best interests at heart, and more importantly the best interests of those I love, my wife and my children. And learning that they did not, that they had not, has been one of, if not the most profound realisations for me. And it gets worse as it goes on, as it turns out. That we can hear this from a Pfizer director in a forum as open, you would think, as the European Parliament, that we were effectively lied to by government and healthcare professionals. And yet all of those people stay in place, unchallenged and unrepentant, should teach us all we need to know about the abusive nature now of our relationship with our leaders. I said before that the revelation is not being generally covered in the wider mainstream press. I've cast my mind back to the fact that I watched the Conservative leadership contest right up to the appointment of Liz Truss as the new Prime Minister, and I noticed all the way through that they had all been complicit on a gross breach of trust. The opposition were the same, Labour were the same. In fact, the vast majority of the elected representatives sitting in Westminster were the same. There's hardly a voice, you count on the fingers of one hand how many voices were raised against any of it. Next to nobody spoke up to try and stop it. None of them uttered a word of apology. Not then, not now. And we're just supposed to pretend like none of it ever happened. And that's the antithesis of any kind of a relationship, notionally or realistically based on trust. And when it comes to the media, make me particularly angry because, let's not forget that Bill Gates, the king of vaccines around the world and the principal funder of the World Health Organization, has paid over $300 million to buy control of media around the world to ensure that messages that further his various agendas get prominence in publications from the BBC through to Lancet, a supposed highbrow publication for medical professionals. And it comes down to a realisation that it's about what it's always been about, which is to say control. When you get right down to it, it's about control of the basics, it's about control of energy, it's about control of food, and it's about control of money. To spread our considerations a little bit wider, I invite you to look again at what is still happening to Dutch farmers. And not only Dutch farmers, but let's just keep the spotlight on them because they kicked off first. They're being driven off their land on the pretext of a nitrogen emergency. And they're being forced off their land, they're being forced to sell their land, they're being forced to cull the herd so that the elites and governments and transnational management entities can take control of their land. And this is something that should concern us all because it's about control. It's not about nitrogen. It's about the authorities wanting to gain control of land so that they can do with it what they want, and it gives them even greater control over food creation and food distribution. And recently there's been replays of Jacinda Ardern. I talked about it last time, where she stood on her podium and said that she was to be regarded as the sole source of truth, or she and her government, or she and her nominated spokespeople were to be the sole source of truth. Now, there's no such thing as the sole source of truth. When someone tells you that they are the sole source of truth, you know you've got a problem. And they're all wriggling on the hooks of their own creation. Justin Trudeau in Canada and his weasel words now about bodily autonomy. And you watch mainstream media figures wriggle, on twist on the hook. Those that spent weeks and months going on about granny killers and refuseniks, and COVIDiots, and how those that wouldn't take the procedures were to be systematically excluded from normal society, pretty much trapped in their homes because of their refusal to take the medical procedures, which we now know had nothing to do with stopping transmission. And I think when trust is broken, trust is like a vase. In that, if you have a vase on the sideboard and it breaks, you can stick it back together again. You could even make a really good job of it so that you can barely see where the cracks were, where the joins are. But you would never really trust it with water and flowers again. Once trust is gone, in that original, purest form that trust existed, it never comes back. You can patch it up. You can create a facsimile of the trust that went before. But everybody knows what happened. And whether it's spoken about or not, in the backs of people's minds, they know that they now live in a new version of reality. And what emotions? Anger, disappointment, but I think ultimately deep sadness that this is the situation in which we find ourselves. So late in the day, I've as I say, in my 50s, I've realised the absolute necessity. The antidote to this is to maintain. Well, part of the solution is to maintain a state of rational scepticism in relation to anything that you're told by authority figures, by anyone you don't know. I mean, you probably, realistically, you should only probably trust a handful of people in your life. Your nearest and dearest, might be worthy of that kind of trust, might be deserving of that kind of trust. But broadly speaking, governments, transnational entities, corporations, institutions of state, watch them. Watch every single move they make, and everything they say, every promise they make, take it with a pinch of salt and do your own reading and sort out for yourself what you think is actually to be believed. And I thought about the past, and even in the relatively recent past, there were limits to how much reach governments and the rest, or kings or emperors, no matter how ambitious they were as individuals, there were limits to the extent to which they could actually get into the everyday lives, far less the minds of people. Whether authority figures liked it or not, for most of history, people had to be left to get on with things. Broadly speaking, as long as they paid their taxes, seemed to obey the king's law or Caesar's law, and turned up for church or its equivalent, on the relevant days of the week, pretty much they had to be left to get on with it. And that was the reality for even the most determined, dictatorial, would-be totalitarian ruler. And I was thinking about the church. The church was very effective, but by the church I'm really talking about, what has come down to us now as the Roman Catholic Church, but which was once upon a time across Europe, that was just the church. And by the application of guilt and fear of hell and damnation, and terror of living in sin and all the rest of it, there was an impressive degree of control was established over people's lives. But then, in the 16th century, came the Reformation. There had been calls for reform of the church before the Reformation actually happened, because for a long time before the Reformation, people, the general population, and church, and representatives of the church, realised that the church was guilty of all sorts of mistakes and abuses of power. Simony was a big deal. That was the selling of church offices. People were being handed the role of bishop because they parted with the relevant sum of money, and people were being sold deals to get out of purgatory and into heaven faster. You could buy these indulgences from your local travelling itinerant priest, and if you parted with some cash, he was going to promise you that you wouldn't have to be in purgatory for as long as you might otherwise have been. So there was all kind of dodgy dealing going on. And then when you got up to the higher level, the church was influencing politics, pushing for the Crusades. I mean, talk about mass formation psychosis. The decades and centuries of the Crusades were manifestations of mass formation psychosis, where populations went mad collectively and went along with things that in their saner moments they must have realised were bonkers beyond belief. But here's where it gets interesting, and where we catch one of those glimpses that we are always looking for, of connections, reminders, parallels between past and present. The church, in large part, maintained control by conducting all its services in Latin, and the Bibles were in Latin. And even if you could read Latin, the Bibles were often chained to the pulpit to make sure that people weren't even tempted to take them away to have a look for themselves. They were entirely dependent on the priests to give them, to inform them of the word of God. And most people couldn't read full stop, and they certainly couldn't read Latin, and they spoke to one another in the vernacular languages. People in England, Scotland, and France, they weren't speaking to each other in Latin, and so they were at one remove from the word of God. But then, of course, in 1439 or whenever it was, Johannes Gutenberg comes up with the printing press, which makes possible for the first time the wide dissemination of material, not in Latin necessarily, but in the vernacular. So Bibles started going out into the general population. People could read the word of God for themselves, and other things, pamphlets, and revolutionary and anti-authoritarian publications from time to time could get widely disseminated for the first time. Now, what does that remind you of? That's the internet in medieval terms, giving unusually large numbers of people for the first time access to information from which hitherto they might have been excluded, or they couldn't get their hands on it. And so too many people, one way or another, learnt about the church, and so that was what made the difference. It was the combination of, once again, people were questioning the authority and the legitimacy of the church, but for the first time it was backed up with information that was widely available and widely disseminated, and it was in that way that the Reformation gained the traction that it needed and made the change. And so you get the Protestant version of the faith Well, it declared a great deal, but by the time you get to places like Britain, like England and Scotland, it was about encouraging people to think that they absolutely did not need priests. They did not need intermediaries between themselves and God. On the contrary, it was the obligation of every member of the congregation to establish their own direct personal relationship with God. That was certainly the nature of Protestantism as it manifested itself in much of Scotland, for example. Under the stewardship of people like John Knox, and John Knox also pushed for a school in every parish, which was revolutionary thinking, because it was his intention that people, young and old, men and women, would be able to read the Bible for themselves and thereby become more godly. And so as a kind of a collateral, unintended consequence of that was, shortly, Scotland became the most literate population in Europe, because so many people had access to schools and education for the first time. And that changed everything. That meant for the centuries thereafter, increasingly there was the presence of an independently minded, self-educated or educated population that could read for itself and get its own answers to questions, rather than simply being spoon-fed all the time. And the irony of the coming of the internet is that the same tool that authoritarians and technocrats want to use to control us is also their Achilles heel, because it simultaneously enables us to share amongst ourselves information that hasn't come directly from the state or other sources of authority, and that hence the frantic censorship that's going on all the time. And the technocrats and mass media and governments getting into bed with one another to try and control the flow of information, because the last thing any of these would-be totalitarians want is people having their access to unofficial information. That's why they go after comedy, because that's another aspect. But comedy's gone at the moment because, apart from anything else, authority figures tend to not like being laughed at. They don't like having their pomposity burst in front of their faces. And that's an old one. Since the beginning of time, the powerful kings, emperors, the church, faith leaders have tended to take themselves very seriously. That's why if you were in the presence of the king, you had to kneel down or lie down face first in front of him, prostrate yourself. And no laughing in church, no laughing in court, because authority knows it's vulnerable if it's not being taken absolutely seriously. There's the great line in, I think it's Richard II, Shakespeare, "For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits." The antic's the court jester, the joker, who used to have exclusive permission to take the piss, even out of the king. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little seen to monarchise, be feared and kill with looks, comes at the last and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell king. That amongst other things, that's Shakespeare acknowledging that kings were vulnerable. They were, at the end of the day, they were just other human beings, and they were certainly vulnerable to death, but while they were alive, they were vulnerable to what people thought of them, and kings don't like that. So that's why you get that's why you get all this censorship and all this, the lapse, the collapse of comedy at the moment. So what I'm saying is, in some form or another, we need another reformation, not of religion. We need a reformation of our relationship to authority, and because it comes from that realisation that those we have trusted are not fit to be trusted. They're not deserving of our trust. And I say again, the importance of paying attention to that Protestant argument about not needing intermediaries, not expecting to be spoon-fed every minute of every day the only important things that you're supposed to know. Remember that ethos that on the contrary, it's each of us as individuals' responsibility and obligation to seek direct communication with the truth, logos, reason, whatever you want to call it, That's what we need. We don't need these characters in between us and the truth. And we don't need to trust these people to tell us the truth, because they are not deserving of the necessary trust. Get sceptical, question everything. And remember that governments, when you get right down to it, are basically there to keep the lights on and the bins emptied. Everything else, they should get away from people and leave people to get on with their lives. And this indulgence to which they have treated themselves, that they are entitled to be inside our heads, telling us what to think, that's where we need a reformation. Our relationship with authority has become abusive, and the only remedy for anyone in an abusive relationship is to walk away and start over with a renewed sense of self-worth and self-reliance. We need a reformation of our relationship with the state.